Patrick Suffo is not the most mentioned name in Cameroon football history, but what he once achieved is enough to place him among the respected warriors of the golden generation. Born in 1978 in Ebolowa, Suffo rose from Cameroon football, maturing through Tonnerre Yaoundé before stepping into Europe in the colors of Nantes, where he was forged in one of the most traditional football environments in France. He once wore the shirts of Barcelona B, Sheffield United, Numancia, Coventry City and many other clubs, leaving his footprints in France, Spain, England, Norway, Israel and the Middle East. But his greatest peak was in the colors of the Cameroon national team. Suffo was a member of the Cameroon Olympic team that won the historic gold medal at Sydney in 2000, one of the greatest feats of African football on the world stage. 2 years later, he continued with Cameroon to win the Africa Cup of Nations in 2002, appearing in that proud collective alongside stars like Samuel Eto'o, Rigobert, Jeremy and Patrick Mboma. He also once stepped onto the World Cup 2002 stage, where only the most excellent players from each nation have the opportunity to be present. A striker who once carried the Cameroon shirt on his shoulders, once touched Olympic glory, once stood in the midst of fierce international matches, should have been remembered as an important part of African football history. But Patrick Suffo's life was much more painful than those lines of achievements. Because football does not only remember goals, titles, or years of sacrifice, it also remembers the moments when humans are weakest, and sometimes remembers them more cruelly than anything. For Suffo, the red cards, the chaotic match at Bramall Lane, and the disappointment at the World Cup 2002 had cast a long shadow over what he had once achieved. The world gradually forgot the Olympic champion, but did not forget the days he lost control. That is the silent pain of a player who once stood very high, then had to live with the feeling of being defined by a few of the worst moments. He is not a perfect person. He was once hot-tempered, once wrong, once paid the price. But what is respectable is that he did not disappear in bitterness. After the criticisms, after the times he had to start over at Numancia, Coventry or smaller teams, Suffo still continued to play, continued to fight, continued to keep himself in football. At the age of 47, the halo has receded far, but his will is still the most worthy part to be honored, because there are those who win with titles, while Patrick Suffo wins by not letting the final mistakes swallow his entire life. Before continuing into the story, please hit subscribe to the channel and leave a heart for Patrick Suffo, an Olympic champion whom history seems to have not given the fair recognition he deserves. And now, let us turn back in time to Ebolowa, Cameroon, where a poor boy carrying a big dream began a journey full of tears, sacrifice and scars that would follow him throughout his life. And to understand why an Olympic champion carries within him the sadness of being forgotten like that, we must go back to Ebolowa, where Patrick Suffo was born in 1978, in a land where football is not only a game of childhood, but also a fragile dream of a different life. There, a boy did not grow up with firm promises that talent would be seen, that effort would be rewarded, that just loving the ball would open the door to the future. Cameroon of those years had many children playing football with bare feet, with old balls, with dusty dirt fields, and with a very naive belief that if they were good enough, one day the world would call their name. But reality was much more cruel. There were children who played better than adults could imagine, then disappeared just because no one discovered them. There were pairs of feet as fast as the wind, but never stepped out of the poor neighborhood. There were dreams that ended not because of lack of talent, but because of lack of money, lack of opportunity, lack of a hand to pull them up at the right time. Patrick Suffo grew up in the darkness of that truth. He saw that football could save a person, but also saw how quickly football could forget a person. Perhaps that is why, very early on, the ball was no longer a childish pleasure for him. It became an escape. It was the only thing that could take a boy from Ebolowa out into the wider world, where there were real stadiums, real jerseys, real contracts, and real opportunities to change life. But to follow that path, Patrick had to pay a price that many fans later never saw. He had to grow up faster than his age. He had to learn to endure rejections. He had to understand that in football, pity does not keep anyone. Only ability and will help a person survive. While other boys still clung to the safety of family, he had to carry much heavier thoughts. If he failed, not only his own dream would collapse, but also the faith of those who had once looked at him would shatter along with it. That is the type of silent pressure, not appearing on the scoreboard, not recorded in the career profile, but weighing on the shoulders of a young player long before he stepped onto the professional field. Patrick Suffo did not just play football for himself. He played football for a deprived childhood, for friends who never had the chance to leave, for dreams that had died silently on the poor dirt fields of Cameroon. And that is exactly what made his journey both beautiful and painful, because every step forward toward Europe was also a step away from his homeland, away from familiar faces, away from the normal life he might have had if the football dream had not called his name. To become a professional player, he had to accept loneliness from very early on. There was no ready paved path. There was no guarantee that sacrifice would be rewarded. There were only long training sessions, tense matches, times of telling himself he was not allowed to be weak, because out there were too many people ready to replace him after just one stumble. That was the first tragedy in Patrick Suffo's life. Before the world knew him as a champion, he had already been a child who had to learn to live like an adult. Before wearing the Olympic medal, he had already carried an invisible burden on his shoulders, and before the red cards made people judge him, he had gone through many years of fighting against the fear of being left behind. When leaving Ebolowa to pursue a bigger path, Patrick did not carry certainty. He only carried a dream, a stubborn belief, and the silent pain of a boy who understood that if he did not leave, he might never be seen. It was from that place, from those days of poverty and lack of opportunity, that the will within him was formed. It was not soft, not poetic, but sharp, burning, and sometimes dangerous. Later, people would say Patrick Suffo was an emotional, strong, determined player, sometimes too hot-tempered. But if looking back at his starting point, one can understand why that fire burned so fiercely. It was born from a childhood that did not allow him to be calm. It was nourished by the fear of missing opportunities. It grew up in an environment where every young talent had to fight not to be forgotten. And for Patrick, football was never just 90 minutes on the field. It was the entire life he had traded to seek a different future. From Ebolowa, Patrick Suffo's path did not open straight to Europe. It had to go through the fierce years of Cameroon football, where talent was never a guaranteed ticket to the future, and where a young player had to learn to survive before being allowed to dream of glory. Tonnerre Yaoundé, one of the most traditional names in Cameroon football, became the first place to seriously test that dream. For a young man like Suffo, stepping into that environment was not just wearing the shirt of a team. It was stepping into a cold screening process, where every training session could decide who was kept, who was pushed out, who still had the chance to continue, and who had to return to the normal life they had tried to escape. There, no one had time to pity a homesick young player. No one stopped to ask if he was scared or not. Cameroon football at that time was full of strong legs, full of boys who were also hungry for opportunities like him, also believing that if they did not win every challenge, the dream could end right before their eyes. Patrick looked around and quickly understood that he was not special just because he had desire. Everyone had desire. Everyone wanted to go far. Everyone wanted to become the one noticed by scouts. Therefore, he had to find a way not to dissolve into the crowd of young talents jostling through the same narrow door. Those early years had trained him in a type of football that was not soft, not decorative, not based on outward beauty. He learned to use his body to protect the ball, learned to rush into spaces with all his strength, learned to endure collisions and stand up immediately because if he lay down too long, others would take his position. Every ball touch was a statement. I am still here. I am still worthy. I have not been eliminated from this race. But it was precisely in that environment that the fire within him also began to burn in a more fierce way. The determination helped him stand out, but it also planted in him a dangerous habit, always playing as if every ball touch was the last match of his life. For many young players from deprived backgrounds, that was both a strength and a curse, because when the entire future is placed on every run, it is very easy for a person to turn desire into tension, will into hot temper, fear of failure into reactions beyond control. Patrick Suffo was not born a controversial player. He was shaped by a system in which softness had almost no place. To survive, he had to be tough. To be seen, he had to be noisy with his feet. To move forward, he had to prove himself every day. Not with promises, but with sweat, with strength, with challenges that made others remember him. But after every training day, after every youth match, behind that strong appearance was still a boy who understood that if he slowed down, the dream could slip from his hands. Perhaps that fear had never truly left him. It went with him from Tonnerre Yaoundé to Nantes, from the Cameroon football fields to the cold stands of Europe. It made him fight non-stop, but it also made every failure heavier than others thought. In his early years in Cameroon, Patrick had witnessed many talents who never went far. Some disappeared because of injuries, some because there was no one to support them, some simply because they did not meet the right time, the right team, the right eyes of a scout. Those names might never appear in history, but for Patrick, they were vivid reminders that football does not wait for anyone. He could not rely on luck. He could not believe that tomorrow would definitely be better. He could only charge forward as if today was the last opportunity. And that is what made his journey both respectable and heartbreaking. Because before Patrick Suffo became an Olympic champion, before he wore the Cameroon shirt in major tournaments, before the world knew about the red cards that would haunt his name, he had already been a young player learning to survive in an environment where every mistake could erase everything. Tonnerre Yaoundé did not only teach him football, it taught him that talent, if not tough enough, would be crushed. It taught him that opportunities are something to be seized, not given. And most importantly, it created in him a fighting spirit that later both brought him to glory and pushed him into the most painful moments of his career. Leaving Cameroon to go to Nantes was not a simple step forward in the career of Patrick Suffo, but a comprehensive shock to the person, culture and emotions. After years of fighting in the harsh environment at Tonnerre Yaoundé, where he learned to survive by strength and willpower, Patrick embarked on a journey that he believed would bring him closer to his big dream. But when he set foot in France, he quickly realized that Europe was not the bright picture that people often told about back home. It was colder, more distant, and much lonelier than the imagination of a young man from Ebolowa. Nantes was not just a club but a completely different world, where everything was organized, disciplined and operated at a pace that a young African player had to take a very long time to adapt to. There were no more familiar neighborhoods, no more voices from home, no more feeling of belonging to a clear place. Patrick Suffo stepped into an environment where talent alone was not enough, because around him were players who were just as hungry, just as well-trained, and just as ready to trade everything to survive. The first days at Nantes were a series of days of silence. He trained in a new language, lived in a new city, and faced a football system where every mistake was remembered for a very long time. In Cameroon, he learned to play football by instinct and strength. In France, he had to relearn to play football with thinking, positioning, and precision. This transition did not happen overnight. It came with a feeling of isolation, when a young man could stand among dozens of people but still feel completely alone. No one said he was not good enough, but no one guaranteed that he would stay. And it was that uncertainty that eroded the spirit the fastest. Each training session became an invisible test, where Patrick had to prove that he was not just a player from Africa, but a real part of European football. The pressure did not come from scoldings, but from the cold silence of the system. There was no room for prolonged mistakes. There was no time to adapt for too long, and in that silence, Patrick gradually understood that the European dream was not a fairy tale, but a continuous series of challenges that never stopped. He began to clearly feel the difference between expectations and reality. Back home, he was a hope. In Europe, he was just one of many names trying to seize a very small opportunity. Loneliness was no longer a fleeting emotion, but became a constant state. There were days, after leaving the training ground, he returned to a quiet room to the point where he could hear his own thoughts clearly. Memories of Cameroon, of Tonnerre Yaoundé, of the days when he still played football with freedom and instinct, began to feel distant like another life. But it was precisely in those moments that Patrick's willpower was tested the most strongly. He was not allowed to collapse, because behind him was an entire journey that had traded so much to be here. Each time he was doubted, he threw himself into training even more. Each time he was not chosen, he reminded himself that the opportunity had not ended. But that resilience also came with a silent change. Patrick was no longer the boy who played football for joy. He became a player who played football out of fear of failure. And that difference, though small, was what shaped his entire later career. Nantes taught him a lot, but it also took away a part of his youthful innocence. It turned the dream into responsibility, and turned football from joy into a never-ending battle for survival. When looking back on that period, perhaps Patrick Suffo not only remembered the training sessions or the matches, but also the feeling of standing between two worlds. One side was the distant homeland waiting, the other side was a future that was never certain, and in between those two things was a young man trying not to disappear in a football system that was too vast, too cold, and had too little room for fragile dreams. Leaving France to go to Barcelona B, Patrick Suffo carried with him a very special feeling, This was no longer a trial step, but a door that could change his entire career. After the years at Nantes, where he learned to survive in the cold European football, Barcelona B appeared like a new light, a place that any young player would dream of setting foot in. But that light, as he later realized, was never truly a guarantee for a solid future. It was only a vague promise, beautiful but full of competition. Right when he stepped into Barcelona's youth system, Patrick Suffo understood that he was not only competing with opponents on the field, but also competing with dozens of other young talents from all over the world, people who also carried the exact same dream as him, people who also believed they could reach the first team. There, everything was more refined, faster, and harsher than what he had ever experienced. There was no longer room for football based on pure instinct like in Cameroon, nor space for simple strength like in lower leagues. Barcelona B demanded perfection in every small detail, from the way of moving, controlling the ball, to reading the game in every fleeting second. And in that environment, Patrick began to clearly feel that he was standing very close to a major turning point in his life, but also very far from being able to surely reach it. Each training session was like an endless challenge, where he had to prove that he was not just a player from Africa carrying physical strength, but a real part of a high-level technical football system. There were days he played well. There were moments he made people notice, but there were also times he realized that consistency was what distinguished a young talent from a player who could go far. And it was at this point that Patrick's career began to show the first cracks in expectations. He did not fail completely, but he also did not break through as people expected. He was in the middle ground, where a player was not immediately eliminated, but also not given a clear opportunity to advance to the first team. That was a state more dangerous than failure, because it made a person live in a feeling of waiting with no end point. While other teammates could advance or leave, Patrick was kept in the in-between, where every effort was not yet enough to create a decisive change. And as time passed, the initial feeling of a big door gradually turned into the realization that not every dream followed the direction people imagined. Barcelona B did not break him with a big shock, but with the cold patience of top-level football, where no one needed to say that you were not good enough, but everything around you would gradually make you understand that. It was during this period that Patrick began to carry a silent regret. He did not know for sure where he had gone wrong, did not know if he needed more time or another opportunity, but he clearly felt that he was standing very close to a threshold that not everyone had the chance to touch, and if he could not step through it, that door would never open a second time. That was one of the quietest tragedies of football. Failure was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply the silence of opportunities that did not come true. Patrick Suffo began to understand that football was not always fair. Not the best person was always the one who continued, not the person who tried the hardest was always the one who succeeded, and not the most deserving person was always given the final opportunity. There were decisions shaped by timing, by the system, by factors that a player could not control. And when he realized that, he also realized that the road ahead for him would never be a straight line. It would be a series of difficult choices, times when he had to start over, and moments when he was forced to accept that the dream might not take the original shape. Barcelona B was not the place where Patrick Suffo's career ended, but it was the place where he first clearly felt the difference between potential and destiny. And that feeling, though not loud, was one of the deepest cuts in his journey, because it came from the very place where he once thought he only needed one more step to reach the greatest thing in a player's life. Leaving Barcelona B, Patrick Suffo carried with him a very special feeling that not every young player had the chance to experience. He had stood very close to a door that could open a career at the highest level in Europe, but could not step through it completely. It was that in-between state that made the next phase in his career no longer simply a journey upward, but a search for answers to a question that was never easy to face. Why were there people who only lacked exactly one step to become something greater than they imagined? When returning to reality after Barcelona B, Patrick Suffo did not collapse immediately, but he began to clearly feel that professional football did not always follow the logic of effort or talent. He had had performances good enough, had shown ability, had proven that he was not an ordinary player, but among a series of other young talents jostling in the same system, the difference sometimes did not lie in how good you were, but in whether you appeared at the right time or not. And for Suffo, that time seemed to always slip away from his hands right at the most important moment. When the opportunity at Barcelona B gradually closed, he was no longer in the state of a player rising strongly, but began to step into a full transition zone of instability where each next decision carried the feeling of trying the dream from the beginning again. The expectations once placed on his shoulders began to weigh heavier, not because he became worse, but because he had once been very close to the peak. And in football, having once been very close sometimes became a heavier burden than never having been expected by anyone. Patrick returned to the harsh reality of a professional player's career. Teams no longer saw him as a developing talent, but as a player who needed to prove everything again. From Nantes to the next choices, he began to step into a period where each contract was no longer a step forward but a new bet. In that environment, he still played, still tried, still left his mark, but the stability that a player needed to develop to the peak gradually became a luxury. Each match was not only an opportunity, but also a repeated test of whether he was still worthy of the expectations he once had in the past or not. And it was that invisible pressure that made his journey much heavier than its appearance. No one said directly that Patrick Suffo had failed at Barcelona B, but no one mentioned him anymore as a player who would certainly reach Barcelona's first team. That silence was what created the biggest void in the mind of a young player. No more praise, nor clear criticism, only waiting that did not know how long it would last. In that void, Patrick began to carry an increasingly clear feeling of regret. He remembered the moments that could have gone differently, the balls that could have been more accurate, the decisions that could have been bolder, but football never allowed rewriting the past. It only moves forward, leaving behind those what-ifs that are never answered. And when looking back, he began to understand that the path he was on was no longer a straight road leading to the peak, but a long journey that had to find ways to survive in the very uncertainty of the profession. From here, Patrick Suffo entered an important phase in his football career, learning to accept that football is not always fair. It is not the hardest working person who is always rewarded. It is not the most talented person who is always chosen, and it is not the most deserving person who is always given the final opportunity. There are decisions that are beyond control. There are choices influenced by the system, by coaches, by timing, and by factors that a young player cannot see entirely. For Suffo, this awareness did not come as a single shock, but as a prolonged process, where each experience after Barcelona B added another piece to that difficult-to-accept truth. And precisely from this point, his journey was no longer the story of a talent progressing closer to glory, but became the story of a man learning to continue moving forward, even when the road ahead no longer had clear light like before. Patrick Suffo entered the Sheffield United phase with a completely different mindset compared to the early years of his career. After the gold medal at the Sydney 2000 Olympics, after the African Championship with Cameroon, after those appearances in the biggest stages of world football, he was no longer a young player looking for opportunities. He became a name carrying expectations, a player whose every decision on the field was scrutinized through the lens of a champion. And that precisely created an invisible weight that not everyone could see, but was always present in every step he ran. When moving to Sheffield United, Patrick stepped into English football, where it is famous for its speed, physicality, and harshness in every challenge. This was not an environment of gentle spaces or comfortable ball handling time. This was a place where every second was compressed, every mistake could lead to immediate consequences, and every player had to fight as if it was the last match of their career. For Patrick, this was both an opportunity and a challenge that redefined his entire path. He came to England not as an unknown player, but as someone who had stood on the Olympic peak, and that made every look directed at him carry an additional layer of pressure. People did not just want to see him play football, they wanted to see whether he truly deserved the titles from his past or not. And in such an environment, there was no room for small deviations. Patrick quickly realized that English football did not care much about the story behind the player. It cared about efficiency, about results, about each specific moment of the ball. If you were strong, you were respected. If you hesitated, you were eliminated. And if you made a mistake in important moments, it would not be easily forgotten. That very truth began to create the first cracks in his psychology. Patrick was not a player lacking determination. On the contrary, he carried too much determination. But at Sheffield, determination alone was not enough. He had to learn to control himself in an environment where every challenge could become a confrontation both physically and mentally. The matches became more tense, not only because of opponents, but also because of the pressure inside him. Every time he stepped onto the field, Patrick was not only playing to win for the team, but also playing to protect the reputation of an Olympic champion, a title that he always carried but at the same time felt it weighing heavily on his shoulders. There were times when he played well, showing the strength and determination that had made his name. But there were also moments when the tension made him react too quickly, decide too strongly, and let emotions override the necessary alertness. Those very moments, even if they did not always happen, had a much greater influence than all of his stable contributions on the field. Because in top-level football, the public's memory often does not remember consistency, but remembers the explosive points. And with Patrick Suffo, those explosive points sometimes came in unwanted ways. When the pressure accumulated over time, it did not disappear. It only transformed. From the pressure to prove himself, it became the pressure of not being allowed to make mistakes. From the pressure of not being allowed to make mistakes, it became tension in every ball-handling moment. And from there, the first signs of mental fatigue began to appear. It was not a clear collapse, but small cracks in the way he reacted, in the way he made decisions, in the way he faced situations that he had previously handled more naturally. Sheffield United did not break Patrick Suffo immediately, but it placed him in an environment where each passing day was a new test, and in that process, success and injury began to appear in parallel. He could win in one moment of the ball, but still feel he was being judged. He could play well in one match, but still know that just one small mistake could change the way others perceived him. That very parallelism between effort and pressure created a complex psychological state, where Patrick was no longer playing only with confidence, but also with the invisible worry that always followed behind. And that was the moment when his journey in English football was no longer just a story about expertise, but began to become the story of a person trying to hold himself steady amid increasingly heavy expectations, in a world that did not allow slowing down and also did not easily forgive moments when a person became fragile. Patrick Suffo entered the Sheffield United phase with a mental state that was both full of ambition and weighed down by the expectations that his own past had created. After the gold medal at the Sydney 2000 Olympics, after the African Championship title with Cameroon, he was no longer an unknown player looking for a place to stand, but became a name carrying the expectation that he must succeed, must prove that the previous glories were not luck. And that very change made every step he took in English football much heavier than what outsiders saw. Sheffield United was not just a new club, but a completely different environment, where football was not only technique or tactics, but also a war of physicality, spirit, and continuous endurance. There, every challenge was like a test of human limits, and every match could change the way a player was perceived in just a few moments. Patrick quickly realized that English football had little space for slowness or hesitation. It demanded quick reactions, quick decisions, and near absolute certainty in every action. But the most difficult thing for him was not only the difference in playing style, but the invisible pressure that came with the label of Olympic champion. People did not look at him as a player trying to integrate, but as someone who had to prove he deserved the titles he already had. Every match, therefore, was no longer simply 90 minutes of play, but became a continuous test of his own value. In that environment, Patrick began to live in a state of prolonged tension. He could not make mistakes, or at least was not allowed to make too many, because every mistake not only affected the match, but also affected the way others perceived his entire career. And that very accumulation of pressure gradually created changes in the way he reacted on the field. The challenges became more intense than necessary. The 50-50 situations became places where he was forced to prove his strength, and sometimes that determination crossed the boundary between control and loss of control. Sheffield United was not the place that broke Patrick Suffo immediately, but it was the place that began to expose the silent tensions that had accumulated from many years before. From Cameroon, through Nantes, Barcelona B, to English football, he had always lived in a state of having to prove himself. But here the pressure no longer came from having opportunities or not, but from being allowed to make mistakes or not. And that was a different form of pressure, heavier, harder to recognize, but eroding a person much faster. The first signs of tension did not appear as a clear collapse, but as small moments in each match, each decision, each reaction. There were times when he played very well, showing the strength, speed, and fighting spirit that had made his name, but right after that, just one unsatisfactory situation was enough to pull him into the vortex of self-doubt. And in top-level football, self-doubt is the most dangerous thing, because it slows reactions, weighs down decisions, and reduces the naturalness that a player inherently has. Gradually, Patrick began to feel that success and injury were no longer separate. Every time he did well, it came with the pressure to maintain it. Every time he made a mistake, it came with the feeling of having to fix it immediately. There was no longer space for calmness. There was no longer space for the carefree feeling like the early days in Cameroon, and that very change made football, which had once been a place of liberation, gradually become a place of continuous psychological testing. At Sheffield United, Patrick Suffo did not lose himself immediately, but he began to live in a state where every match could be a step forward or a small slip, and sometimes, if those small slips accumulated long enough, they would create irreversible changes in the way a person played, reacted, and existed in the world of professional football. Almost. After the moment at Bramall Lane, Patrick Suffo stepped out of the lights of English football, with a heavy feeling that no criticism could fully describe. That match not only left a red card, but also left a lasting mark in the way people perceived him. And when he returned to the Cameroon national team to participate in the 2002 African Cup of Nations, he carried not only the shirt of an Olympic champion, but also the shadow of the controversies that had not yet settled down. However, in the colors of the indomitable Lions, Patrick Suffo once again had the opportunity to stand in the strongest collective in Africa at that time. Cameroon entered the tournament with the confidence of a team that had reached the world peak in Sydney and was also possessing a golden generation with names that had or would become icons like Samuel Eto'o, Rigobert Song, Jeremy or Patrick Mboma. In that context, Suffo was not the center, but he was a part of the winning machine operating with the sole goal, winning the African Championship. And when the tournament took place, Cameroon once again proved its strength through a deep run and finally winning the championship. That was the moment that should have brought complete liberation for Patrick Suffo. A continental title, a time standing on the peak with the national team, an affirmation that he was still a part of the golden generation, still a true champion. But football does not always erase memories in such a simple way. Even though Cameroon won, even though he stood among his teammates lifting the African Cup, there was still a very difficult-to-name feeling surrounding Patrick Suffo. It was not peace, but something temporary, because what had happened at Sheffield United, and after that the way the media perceived him, did not disappear just because a new title appeared. Instead, it still existed like a layer of dust covering all achievements. After Cannes 2002, instead of only being mentioned as an African champion, Patrick still had to live with the question of whether he could control himself in important moments or not. And that was the deepest tragedy of his. Even when winning, he was still not completely freed from his own past. The doubts did not disappear. They only changed shape. Previously, people doubted him because of a specific match. Now they began to doubt him as a type of player. Strong but easily losing control, talented but unstable, capable of creating good moments but also capable of causing unwanted situations. And once that image had formed, it was very difficult to completely erase. Patrick Suffo understood that better than anyone. He was not someone who did not know he had won major titles. He was also not someone who was not proud when wearing the Cameroon national team shirt in a great generation. But at the same time, he also realized that every time he stepped onto the field, he was not only playing for the present, but was also playing to fight against others' memories of him. Every touch of the ball became an opportunity to repair the image. Every match became an effort to prove that he was not just those mistaken moments that people remembered. But football does not always allow rewriting the story the way the player wants. There were good matches that were not enough to change a preconceived judgment. There were victories that were not strong enough to erase an image deeply imprinted in the public's mind. And Patrick Suffo began to clearly feel that injustice. He was a champion, but not always treated like a champion. He was a winner, but still had to constantly explain about past failures. Precisely that tension between glory and doubt created a very special psychological state. The feeling of always having to fight, even when standing at the peak. There was no moment that was truly the end of the battle. Each title was only a temporary stop before the old questions returned. And in that journey, Patrick Suffo gradually understood that football was not only a competition of technique or physical strength, but also an endless battle between the current person and the image left by the past. Cannes 2002 brought him a trophy, but did not bring complete liberation. He was still a part of Cameroon's football history, but at the same time still a name that people could not mention without evoking controversies. And that was what made his story heavier. Not because he had no success, but because that success was not big enough to completely erase what had happened before. From this point on, Patrick Suffo was no longer simply a player playing football. He became a person who always had to live in an endless dialogue with his own past. a past that never truly left, no matter how many times he tried to move forward. Patrick Suffo entered the 2002 World Cup with a feeling that was both proud and heavy, as if his entire previous journey had led straight to this moment, but at the same time also brought along a nameless pressure. This was the biggest stage of world football, where every player was seen most clearly, but also where every mistake was magnified to a level that could not be hidden. For Suffo, the World Cup was not just a tournament, but an opportunity to affirm that he was not only an Olympic champion or a physically strong player in European tournaments, but also an important part of Cameroon's golden generation. But at the same time, it was also where all the doubting eyes began to turn toward him more than ever. Cameroon entered the tournament with great expectations after successes at the Sydney 2000 Olympic and Caen 2002, and Suffo was in the collective carrying the hope of an entire nation. However, when the tournament began, the pressure did not decrease but instead became even heavier, because every match was a test not only of ability, but also of the ability to control oneself in decisive moments. The match against Germany became the most painful turning point in his World Cup journey. Against an experienced and disciplined opponent, Cameroon was forced to play with high intensity and maximum fighting spirit. But precisely in that tense atmosphere, everything began to go out of control. Patrick Suffo, who already carried pressure from previous controversies at Sheffield United, once again fell into a moment where determination turned into heavy consequences. The second red card in that fateful year was not only a referee's decision, but became a symbol for a chain of events that had followed him throughout the entire season. When he left the field, the feeling was not only disappointment, but also the heaviness of knowing that the world would again see him through the same old lens. Cameroon was ultimately eliminated from the tournament in great disappointment, and although the collective still had proud moments, individual Patrick Suffo once again became the focus of criticism. The media did not look at his entire journey, did not look at the efforts that had brought him to the World Cup, but focused on the brief moment on the field, and that was precisely what made his story more painful. A career not defined by the entire long journey, but narrowed down to a few seconds of losing control. From that point on, Patrick Suffo's image on the world's biggest stage was no longer simply a Cameroon player, but became a name associated with controversy, with red cards, with questions that never had fair answers. The saddest thing was that he never gave up. After the World Cup, he still continued to play, continued to fight at the club level, continued to try to prove that he was not just one mistaken moment. But the pressure from that tournament did not disappear. It followed him in every subsequent match, in every decision on the field, in every look from the media and fans. The 2002 World Cup was not the end of Patrick Suffo's career, but it was where his reputation was most deeply damaged. And from that moment on, every step he took in football carried an inseparable shadow, the shadow of a tournament that should have been the peak of glory, but instead became one of the most painful chapters in his life. After the 2002 World Cup, Patrick Suffo left the tournament with an invisible wound that followed him throughout the rest of his career. It was not a muscle injury, not a fitness problem, but a crack in the way the world saw him, and more importantly, the way he was forced to see himself. From that moment on, every step in his career was no longer simply moving forward, but became a continuous effort to escape the shadow of the past. When moving to Numancia, and then to Coventry City, Patrick Suffo was no longer a young player full of potential looking for opportunities, nor an Olympic champion expected to explode in Europe. He became a player carrying a bigger question than all, whether he could start over or not. At Numancia, the football environment was not as glamorous as the big stages he had experienced. It was a place where stability was valued more than fame, where each player had to prove their value through every match, every simple but effective handling. For Patrick, this was an opportunity to start over, to show that what happened in the past did not define his entire person. He played with high focus, trying to maintain stability, trying to minimize mistakes, trying to become a calmer version of himself, and in many matches, he achieved that. There were solid performances, there were moments he proved he was still a quality player, still able to contribute to the team, still able to be an important part of the tactical system. But Patrick Suffo's problem did not lie in the pure ability to play football. The problem lay in the way the world saw him. The things he did well were often seen as normal, while even a small mistake was enough to evoke all the old memories. That was the silent injustice that very few players had to face at his level. When moving to Coventry City, the story repeated in a different form. English football, where it had witnessed his tense moments at Sheffield United, was now the place where he tried to prove that he had changed. He was no longer a player who only blindly rushed into intense situations. He tried to control himself better, tried to read the match better, tried to become a more mature player in mindset. Training sessions became the place where he quietly rebuilt his image. No grand statements, no promises, only repeated persistence day after day. But professional football was not always fair to silent efforts. The positive things Patrick did often did not create newspaper headlines. They were not dramatic enough to be remembered long-term. Meanwhile, the memories of red cards, of controversies, of the 2002 World Cup still existed like a layer of dust clinging to every story related to him. Every time he stepped onto the field, it seemed he was not only playing against opponents, but also playing against his own image in others' eyes. That was a battle with no clear starting whistle and no ending time. There was only the silent continuation of a person who always had to prove that he was not just his own past. In the years at Numancia and Coventry, Patrick Suffo did not give up. He did not disappear, did not leave football, did not choose to let go, but he also never truly escaped the shadow of what had happened before. Every match was an opportunity, but also a reminder. Every successful touch was a small step forward, but every mistake, no matter how small, could pull him back to the starting point in others' perception. And precisely in that state, Patrick Suffo's playing career became a long journey of silent persistence, not a journey of brilliant shining, but a journey of a man trying to hold on to a second chance, even knowing that it was never as easy as the first chance. After the years at Numancia and Coventry City, Patrick Suffo entered a phase where his career no longer followed a straight line, but became a fragmented journey through many countries, many leagues, and many different levels of football. From a player who once stood at the peak of the Sydney 2000 Olympics, who once wore the Cameroon national team shirt in the golden generation, he gradually moved through teams whose names no longer carried the same weight as before. The new destinations were no longer big stages with bright lights and stands full of fans, but smaller stadiums, where football was still played seriously, but the world's attention was no longer directed there. Each club transfer, Patrick again had to start over from the beginning. A new environment, a new system, a new group of teammates, and once again the familiar task, proving that he still had value. But over time, those restarts no longer carried the feeling of opportunity, but became signs of drifting. His career did not collapse in a single moment, but gradually dissolved through each transfer decision, each season that no longer created clear progress, each departure without any accompanying noise. Patrick Suffo's reputation, once associated with the Sydney Olympics, with the Cameroon national team, with the biggest tournaments in the world, was gradually worn down by time and the changes of modern football. Meanwhile, his generation of teammates in Cameroon continued to be mentioned as legends. Names like Samuel Eto'o or Rigobert Song are increasingly honored in the history of African football, while Patrick quietly drifts away from the spotlight of the media. Not because he no longer exists in football, but because he is no longer in the place that history usually remembers. This constant shifting creates a special feeling in his life, the feeling of not truly belonging to any place for very long. At every team he is only a short part in a larger story, and when that story ends, he has to leave again to start a new chapter somewhere else. That makes his life lack the necessary stability that a player needs to develop sustainably, but at the same time it also makes him a person who is always in a state of adaptation. However, continuous adaptation also comes with a silent price, the feeling of no longer having a deep attachment to any collective. When there is no fixed place to call home in football, every success becomes temporary, and every failure does not feel too different either. Over time, Patrick begins to witness something harder to accept than the failures on the field. The fact that players who once played with him, who once shared the same era, gradually become legends mentioned in historical stories, while his name fades in the collective memory. Not because he is completely inferior to them, but because his journey was not stable enough to be told in a complete way. And in that silence, the feeling of loneliness begins to appear more clearly. Loneliness is not the absence of people around, but when the world that once called his name now gradually shifts to calling the names of others. Patrick Suffo once stood at the peak of international football, once was a part of one of the most successful generations of Cameroon, but as time passed he gradually realized that the peak is not a place where people stay forever. It is only a point of passage, and if there is not enough stability to maintain one's position, people will gradually be pushed down without any clear boundary. And that is the most silent tragedy in his journey. Not a big fall, but the gradual drifting away from the light, until only the memories of those once very brilliant days remain. But now they belong to a distant past. Patrick Suffo entered the final phase of his professional playing career with an increasingly clear silence. After years passing through France, Spain, England, and many other countries, he no longer appears in central football stories. There are no longer matches closely followed by the media, no longer big newspaper headlines for his name, and no longer the feeling that every time he steps onto the field is an event of national interest. Instead, Patrick Suffo's playing life gradually shifts to a different rhythm, slower, quieter, and much less illuminated than the days when he still wore the Cameroon shirt at Olympic Sydney 2000 or competed in major tournaments. What is special about this phase is not what he achieved, but the way he chooses to face that change. While many players of the same generation may try to retain the halo through media, statements, or frequent appearances, Patrick Suffo chooses a completely different path: silence. He is not someone who often shares about his personal life. There is not much information about his family, about personal wounds, or behind-the-scenes stories that he brings to the public. This reticence makes him harder to understand in the eyes of fans, but at the same time it also shows a very clear choice. He does not want his life to continue to be defined by external judgments. After many years living under the pressure of professional football, where every mistake can be exaggerated, where every moment can become a headline, Patrick begins to understand that peace does not lie in fame, but in the ability to control what does not need to be made public. He gradually withdraws from debates, no longer appears in controversial stories, no longer lets himself be pulled into opposing opinions as before. That is not disappearance, but a conscious choice, choosing silence to protect the rest of his life. In the world of football, where attention always comes with pressure, keeping distance from the media is not easy, especially for someone who once played on big stages. But Patrick Suffo seems to understand very clearly that if he continues to live in the spotlight, he will never escape the old view of the world about him. And so, he chooses to live on the edge of that attention, not because he is pushed out, but because he steps out himself. What is more important is that in that silence, he does not completely lose football. He still remains attached to the sport that has shaped his entire life, but no longer in the central position. Instead of being someone judged through every match, he becomes an observer, a person with experience, someone who understands better than anyone the price of every decision on the field. From a player who always had to prove himself, he shifts to a person who understands that self-worth does not only lie in what is recognized by the public. This change brings him a form of peace that he did not have the opportunity to experience before. No longer the pressure to meet every expectation, no longer the burden of having to repair his image in the eyes of others, Patrick Suffo begins to find a less noisy version of life, but perhaps more authentic. He does not need to appear frequently to prove that he still exists. He does not need to explain his past to be forgiven. And most importantly, he no longer has to live in the continuous loop of being judged. In this phase, football is no longer a place that creates pressure, but becomes a part of memory, a part of the foundation that has helped him understand more about people, about success, and even the limits of himself. Patrick Suffo does not disappear from the world of football, but he leaves the position that the world once placed him in. And in that withdrawal he finds something that perhaps throughout his turbulent career he did not have many opportunities to experience: the quietness of a life no longer defined by the gaze of the crowd. After many years being swept up in the whirlwind of professional football, from the big stadiums in Europe to less illuminated tournaments, Patrick Suffo finally steps into the phase where his playing career gradually recedes into the background. There is no noisy announcement, no grand farewell moment like the big stars usually have. The end comes naturally, like the way light slowly turns off after a long day, not sudden but clear enough to know that an important chapter has closed. When the cleats are no longer attached to daily training sessions, Patrick steps into a completely different world, where he is no longer judged through every touch of the ball, every match, or every split-second decision. But that does not mean football disappears from his life. On the contrary, it only changes shape, from a profession to a part of memory and a new mission. He begins to engage with the work of training and developing young players, where the experiences of an entire long career are passed on to the next generation. In smaller training fields, where there are no tens of thousands of spectators or television lights, Patrick finds a new role: the guide, the sharer, and sometimes the warner. He does not talk about football as a perfect dream. He talks about it as a path full of challenges, where talent is only the starting point, and perseverance, discipline, and the ability to endure pressure are what determine whether a player can go far or not. With young players, Patrick Suffo is not only a former national team player or an Olympic champion, he is a living proof of both sides of football, the light of glory and the darkness of pressure. He recounts his journey not to impress, but to help young people understand that the road ahead is never as simple as they think. There are days when he stands on the sidelines of the training field, observing the boys trying to repeat the movements he once performed thousands of times in his career. And in those moments, memories return, not as regret, but as a part of the journey that has passed. The matches in Cameroon, the years in Europe, the moments of glory and the times of criticism all become living lessons more vivid than any textbook. However, even when passing on experience, Patrick Suffo still carries something not easy to let go, regrets that have never completely disappeared. They are no longer noisy like before, no longer appear in the form of pressure every time he steps on the field, but still exist in the silence of private thoughts. He once stood very close to the peak of European football, once wore the shirts of big national teams and clubs, but also experienced moments where just one small mistake changed the way the whole world looked at him. And it is this interweaving of glory and wounds that creates a complex person, someone who is both proud of what he has achieved and quietly reflective before what could have been different. When he no longer plays, Patrick learns to live without the continuous recognition from the crowd. This is not an easy thing for someone who once lived in an environment where every action is judged, every result is publicized, and every mistake can become a headline. But over time, he gradually understands that self-worth does not only lie in the gaze of others, it also lies in what he can pass on, what he can help others avoid, and the way he chooses to face his own past. The peace he finds is not forgetting everything, but acceptance. Acceptance that his career has both light and darkness, that he is not perfect but also not completely defined by the moments of mistakes. And in that acceptance, Patrick Suffo finally finds a form of balance that throughout the years of high-pressure playing, he rarely had, a life that is no longer noisy, no longer with heavy expectations, but meaningful enough for him to feel that his journey, though full of pain, is still not meaningless. When looking back at Patrick Suffo's entire journey, from a boy born in Ebolowa to standing under the lights of Olympic Sydney 2000, one cannot find a simple straight line leading from the starting point to the ending point. It is a journey full of twists and turns, brilliant advances mixed with long slips, and moments where the boundary between glory and wounds becomes so blurred that even the person involved finds it hard to distinguish. There are days when he stands at the peak of world football with Cameroon, winning Olympic gold medals, lifting the African Championship, wearing the national team shirt at the World Cup, moments that any player would consider the peak of their life. But there are also other days where the same person is remembered not for victories, but for red cards, tense matches, and moments of losing control that the media have etched deeper than any goal he ever scored. And it is this contrast that creates a very special tragedy in Patrick Suffo's life. A tragedy that does not lie in his lack of success, but in the fact that his success is never remembered completely. Football, as it has always operated, tends to simplify memories. It keeps the strongest images, the most controversial moments, and sometimes forgets the entire journey behind. With Suffo, that meant those grueling years in Cameroon, the efforts at Nantes, Barcelona B, Sheffield United, Numancia or Coventry, those moments when he fought to adapt to European football, all gradually shrinking in the face of situations that people remember more easily, but that do not fully reflect the man he was. But if people only look at the negative moments, they will miss an important part of the story, a man who never stopped getting back up after every fall. Each mistake, instead of making him disappear, pushed him back onto the field, back to new efforts, new teams, new opportunities, even if not always at the peak like before. And it was precisely that persistence that shaped the true legacy of Patrick Suffo, not perfection, but the ability to keep moving forward even after being judged, criticized, and misunderstood. The price of fame in football is not only in the spotlight, but also in the fact that every moment can be remembered in an incomplete way. Patrick had lived long enough in that world to understand that people do not always see the whole story, they only see the most highlighted segments. But that does not change the fact that he had dedicated his entire career to football, had represented Cameroon on the biggest stages, and had gone through ups and downs that not every player has the chance to experience. When looking back, the tragedy of Patrick Suffo is not the red cards, not the controversial matches, and not the difficult periods in his career. The greater tragedy is the gap between what he had truly done and the way he is remembered. But if one goes beyond that selective memory, what remains is the image of a player who had lived his journey to the fullest, a person who had touched glory, had faced failure, had gone through many different football environments, and most importantly, had never stopped trying to stand up every time life forced him to start over. And perhaps that is the true legacy of Patrick Suffo. Not a story of mistakes or controversies, but a story of a man who had gone through enough light and darkness to understand that the value of a life cannot be measured only by perfect moments, but must be seen in the entire long journey full of effort, perseverance, and never stopping moving forward. When his professional playing career came to a close, Patrick Suffo did not step away from football like someone leaving the past completely behind, but like someone who had gone through enough to understand that football would always remain in him no matter in what form. Those years playing in Cameroon, France, Spain, England, and many other countries not only left titles like the gold medal at the Sydney 2000 Olympics or the African Championship in 2002, but also left a complex emotional journey where glory and pressure always went hand in hand. And when the roar of the stands no longer echoed every week, Patrick began to enter a new phase of his life, where he was no longer defined by goals or red cards, but by the way he chose to live with those memories. He returned to football in a different way, getting involved in training and developing young players, where smaller training fields replaced the huge stadiums once associated with his name. There, he was no longer the figure scrutinized for every touch of the ball, but became the one standing on the sidelines, observing and passing on what he had learned through an entire career full of ups and downs. The lessons he brought were not only about tactics or technique, but also about pressure, about expectations, and about the price of living in the spotlight for too long. He told the young players about the moments standing at the peak with Cameroon, about the joy of winning the Olympic gold medal, but he also did not hide the difficult periods at Sheffield United or the World Cup 2002, where every mistake was exaggerated and lasted longer than the moment itself. It was that honesty that gave what he shared the weight of real experience, not theory. Even so, deep down, Patrick Suffo still carried regrets that had never completely disappeared. They were no longer as noisy as before, no longer appearing as direct pressures on the field, but still existed in quiet thoughts about what could have been different if a few moments in his career had gone another way. He understood that football is a sport that never allows going back to the past, and every decision on the field could become part of a memory far longer than the person involved would wish. But instead of letting those regrets define his life, Patrick gradually learned to accept them as part of the journey. He realized that the value of a player lies not only in titles or perfection, but also in the ability to get back up after falls, to continue playing, to continue existing in an environment that is always changing and never easy. When he no longer depended on the recognition of the crowd, he began to find another kind of peace, not radiant but more enduring. It was the peace that came from understanding that he had lived football to the fullest, had gone through every emotion of a player's profession, from the Olympic peak to the days of criticism, from the spotlight to the quiet behind the scenes. And in that silence, Patrick Suffo finally found something that throughout those years of high-pressure playing he had rarely had, a life that no longer needed to prove anything to the world, but was still meaningful enough for him to feel proud when looking back at his entire journey. If the story of Patrick Suffo helps you understand more about the price of glory, the silent pressures and the journey of getting back up after mistakes, please hit subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying stories like this full of football emotions. Thank you for following until the end of the video, and see you again in the next story where we continue to explore the lives behind the stadium lights, where glory and pain always go hand in hand.